Hello, first years. My name's Clark, and I wanted to make an all-inclusive guide to your first year of medical school. When I first started med school last year, I had no idea what I was getting myself into and would have absolutely loved a guide like this. There's a lot to talk about, and I want to make this guide as quick as possible, so let's get right into it. Before we start the guide, I just want to give you all a few seconds to celebrate getting accepted into IUSM. It's not easy. This is a very exciting time in life. You're all going to be future doctors and someday change the lives of others for the better. And on that note, I think we've had enough celebrating for now. So, what should you be expecting from this guide? First of all, I'll give you all some general advice for medical school. After that, I'll give you what I and many others believe are the best resources to study with. And finally, I'll spend the remainder and majority of this video breaking down each class of first year and giving you all what I believe is the best way to approach each class. I don't expect or even recommend watching the sections all at once. I'll include the timestamps for each class in the description so you can come back to this video as you start each new class and see what's in store. Let's start off with the most important part of this guide, and I'm only half kidding, what the best bars in town are. I asked a lot of my classmates to fill out a questionnaire, and here are some of the answers. I'm not going to read all these responses, but you're more than welcome to pause and read them all yourselves. I will note, though, that a lot of people mention Chasers as a pretty good spot. Well, they're not wrong. Here's some more advice, and again, I won't read it, but I would like to mention this response saying the first semester of med school being the hardest. They're absolutely right. In my opinion, the first year of med school is the hardest, especially the first semester, and that is solely because you have to teach yourself to learn a large amount of content in a short period of time. However, you do adapt to this quicker and quicker, and eventually by the end of first year, you will be a learning machine. And here's some more advice. Again, pause if you would like to read it. So here's a bit of my personal advice. First, this school is truly pass or fail, at least in the first 2 years. So what does that mean? It means the grade you receive after every class is over is going to be either a pass or fail. There's no A's, there's no B's, there's no C's. In addition, there are no class rankings. So if you get 100% on every single test you take, and your friend gets a 70 on every test, when it's eventually time to apply to residency, they won't be able to tell the difference. With that being said, do not stress over overstudying just to hit a 90%. In my opinion, it's much better to have a healthy lifestyle and get a 75% than deprive yourself of sleep and happiness for a 90 because, again, at the end of the day, those are the exact same grades in a pass-fail system. Additionally, get to know your classmates. One advantage of being at a small regional campus like Evansville is that pretty much everyone knows everyone else, so you can be very close as a class. Your classmates are your support system and vice versa. We're all in this together. My next tip is to never be afraid to take a day off, or even two. Again, being at a pass-fail school makes this a lot more possible than if we were at a school with grades. Mental health is very important to monitor during med school, and I'm a firm believer that you should always take care of yourself before anything else. Finally, always feel free to reach out to either me, the other second years, or your fellow first years. We're all in the same struggle boat together and understand what it's like going through the emotional roller coaster that is med school. One last thing before we jump into the resources, I wanted to talk about step one. If you don't know what step one is, it's basically a boards test you take after your second year. There are 3 step exams you take, the first one being after your second year, the second one being after your third year, and the third one being, I think, during or after your first year of residency. I'm not too sure. But anyways, historically, step one was a very important, if not the most important part of your residency application. It was basically what the MCAT was in your med school application. But starting in January next year, step one will be reported only as pass-fail, meaning your class, as well as my class, will not be receiving a numeric score for this test. So what does that mean? Well, first, it means less stress for us, at least during the first 2 years of med school. The pass rate of step one is over 95%, and I have no doubt that all of you will pass the exam without trouble. With that being said, I would still recommend to study for step one as if it was for a numeric score. This is because step 2 CK, the test you take after third year, will still be scored. It's basically been accepted that step 2 CK is going to be the new step one, as in The score you get for that really influences your chances at certain residencies. And the highest predictor for your Step 2 CK score over everything else is actually your Step 1 score. And that's because there's about 60% content overlap between the two tests. Step 2 CK is simply Step 1 with more patient care type questions. So to summarize this slide, enjoy the fact that your first boards exam is pass-fail, but still try to study as hard as you can for it because, again, it heavily influences your Step 2 grade. And with that, let's dive into some resources. There are a countless amount of resources out there for med school, but I decided to talk about the most popular ones that have been widely accepted as the best. I'll be talking about Anki, which is personally my favorite study tool. I'll also talk about First Aid, Boards and Beyond, Sketchy, Pathoma, and Pixorize, which are all great content resources. Finally, I'll talk about the most popular question banks out there. So here's my absolute favorite resource out of them all, Anki. Anki is a flashcard program that incorporates spaced repetition into when you review each flashcard. So what this means is if you get a card correct, you'll see it 1 day later. And if you get it right again, you'll see it 3 days later, and then 7, and then 15 if you keep getting it right. This is very effective in getting information into your long-term memory. This program is completely free on the computer. There are also apps for this on Apple and Android. It's free on Android and about $30 in Apple, which I know may seem like a lot for an app, but trust me, it is the best $30 you will ever spend. You can pull up Anki on your phone when you're waiting in line for Starbucks, for example, and just chip away at some cards. And every minute counts in med school. With Anki, you can either create your own cards or use pre-made decks. Honestly, creating your own cards is one of the best ways to study, but the issue here is that it is very, and I mean very, time-consuming. And it also takes a while to learn how to properly make cards that are effective for studying. I highly recommend using pre-made decks instead of creating your own cards just for the sake of time. There are a few popular pre-made decks out there for Step 1, which you can also use for the IU exams as there is quite a bit of overlap. Additionally, starting in MCT, which is the second class of first year, I was making very comprehensive Anki decks for every class exam. I'll be making a separate guide specifically for Anki, and in that guide I will give you guys the links to both my decks for the IU tests and the Step 1 decks. A big benefit of using Anki is that it is extremely time efficient. You're only quizzed over things that the algorithm has determined is due for the day, and nothing else. This is the #1 tool to avoid overstudying. My only warning for Anki is to avoid memorizing the card itself. It can be very easy to identify the answer to a question just by seeing the common words after you've seen the card a few times. But that's not going to help the information stick in your head. Always try to understand the concept behind the card to make the most out of Anki. And with that, let's talk about our next resource. First Aid is by far the most comprehensive resource for Step 1 out of anything mentioned in this guide. Anything you might need to know for Step 1 will be in this book. It's about $60 on Amazon, so it's not too pricey. If you're out of state like me, it's literally less than 1/1000th of a year's tuition. One drawback is that First Aid only highlights high-yield facts, facts that are commonly tested on Step 1. IU lectures and tests contain a lot of low-yield information that is not tested on Step 1, so First Aid cannot serve as a complete replacement for the IU lectures. I'd recommend watching the IU lectures first, then reading First Aid if you want a quick review of the material. Boards and Beyond is basically First Aid but in video format. There are about 450 videos that are very well organized. Personally, I prefer this over First Aid because watching videos is less mentally taxing than reading. I honestly found myself watching Boards and Beyond for each test we had because they have videos for almost every topic. The only downside to Boards and Beyond is that it's pretty pricey at around $300 for an 18-month subscription. You can get a shorter subscription for cheaper, but buying an 18-month subscription will last you until March of your second year, which is right before you take Step 1. Good old Sketchy. Sketchy is a content resource utilizing the memory palace study technique. Basically, they'll draw out a cartoon scene with memorable items and attach those items to facts about either a drug if you're watching a pharm video, or a pathogen if you're watching a microbiology video. For the second and third exams of post-defense, which you take in the middle of your spring semester, this is the only resource you will need. Literally. My classmates and I all abandoned the IU lectures for these two tests because Sketchy was just that good. I have no idea what the price for this resource is, and I hope none of you will have to either, if you know what I mean. Just ask me or one of my second year classmates and we'll hook you up. Pathoma is a resource that will tell you everything you need to know about pathology. If you look at the picture on this slide, you may notice that it's a book, and if you hate books, then don't worry. It also comes with a video format too, which is what 90% of people use. The first three chapters of Pathoma are very good for the second half of FHD, which is your first class in the spring semester. These chapters directly describe the principles of pathology. The rest of the chapters in Pathoma are kind of like Boards and Beyond, but more pathology focused, and they're alright, but they're not needed. I also have no idea how much this one costs, and hopefully you won't ever have to either. The final content resource I'll mention is Pixorize. Pixorize is basically Sketchy with the Memory Palace cartoons, but this is for biochem and immunology. It costs $130 a year for a subscription to only the biochem or immunology videos, or $200 a year for both. Personally, I've never used this, but I've heard it's useful. Given the price of it though, I'd personally spend the money on other resources like Boards and Beyond, but I'm sure if you do buy this, it would be helpful. And here are some of the more popular question banks people use for practice questions. By far, the best one is UWorld. They style their questions very similar to Step 1 and have absolutely amazing explanations for every question. UWorld is pretty pricey though, but every year during the spring semester, all of IU gets together to buy a discounted group bundle, so just wait for that, because you don't really need UWorld early on at med school. Amboss and USM RX are also pretty solid question banks with good explanations. Off the top of my head, I don't really remember the price, but it's probably worth to buy these if you want extra practice questions. Board Vitals is basically off-brand UWorld, but you can get it free through IU. I honestly don't remember how to do this, but you can ask some of my classmates and they might remember, or you can even ask me and we'll struggle to figure it out together. BRS is a decent question bank that I only recommend using for human structures. Like Sketchy and Pathoma, I don't know the price. Wink wink. And with that being said, let's jump into some class-specific tips. I'll have a common format on how I cover each class. First, I'll recommend which IU lectures to watch. IU's med school has 9 campuses, and in the past, each campus would have their own lecturer. Starting last year, however, IU started having statewide lectures, which were universal to all 9 campuses. The only class without statewide lectures was human structures, and I'll dive into which campus lecture I recommend for that later. I'll also recommend the most popular outside resources for each class, and then bring it all together and say how I'd recommend approaching and studying for the class as a whole. Finally, I'll throw some random advice for the class at the end that I think may be helpful. Just a quick disclaimer, but everyone learns and processes information differently, and I recognize that. So my recommendation for studying may not work perfectly for each and every one of you. I will say that I've taken feedback from a lot of my classmates for the final recommendations though, so for most of you, it should work pretty well. Your first class in med school is transitions, and it doesn't even feel right calling this a class. I won't follow the format I just laid out for you guys because this class is very simple. So transitions is a 2-week long class with mandatory attendance. For my class, it was all on Zoom, and I don't know if you guys will also be on Zoom or in person. The only downside of this class is that sometimes it gets pretty boring, and I'll include a picture of one of my classmates last year if you don't believe me. If I remember correctly, the only grade for this class is the final exam, and I guarantee that each one of you will pass it. The passing grade is around a 67, and nobody at our campus got under an 80 last year. I will note that you do have to know a bit about the oath and community service, as I didn't study those at all, thinking it wasn't too important, and I ended up missing a few questions on the test because of that. My biggest tip for this class is to use this time to hang out with your classmates and to get to know each other. This is the most free time you'll have for the rest of med school besides winter and spring break. Also, for this class, you don't need to worry about studying from day one. Starting to study a couple days before the exam is more than enough. Your second class is FCP, which stands for Foundations of Clinical Practice. Like transitions, this class is very simple, so I won't follow the long format. This class starts right after transitions and continues throughout your entire first year. You're going to be taking this class alongside some other main class at the same time. So you'll be taking this at the same time you take human structures, then MCT, and then FHD, and so on. As the name implies, in this class you learn the basics of clinical practice such as history taking and the physical exam. Don't worry too much about being amazing at either of these, as I still have no idea what the thyroid is supposed to feel like. You usually have a random writing assignment each week, but I wouldn't worry about these. If you spend about 15 minutes writing something that somewhat makes sense, you'll be more than fine on these assignments. FCP as a whole is a pretty stress-free class, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. Just enjoy the practice you get as it helps build your foundation as a future physician. So your third class in med school is human structure, which is IU's fancy way of saying anatomy. This class starts right after transitions, just like FCP, and it lasts about half of the first semester. The grading for this class is divided into three portions: lecture, histology, and lab, with lecture being about half of each test grade and histology and lab being a fourth each. This class, in my opinion, is the hardest class in med school, and I guarantee you a lot of my classmates can agree. The reason isn't that content is hard, it's just that it's really your first time experiencing this much of content in such a short period of time. This class is a good time to experiment with various study strategies, including Anki and practice questions, and while it is the hardest class, I'm sure if you work hard, you're going to be just fine in it. Because human structure is so unique in that you're graded based off lecture, histo, and lab, I decided to kind of make two of the same format for both lecture and histo because they're kind of similar in how you study. So I'll start with lecture. So for the IU lectures, as I said, human structure is the only one without those statewide lectures. I highly recommend you watch the Fort Wayne lectures by Dr. Hoffman. And I think you can access last year's lecture through Kaltura. And off the top of my head, I don't really remember how to do that. I haven't used that in a while, but I'm sure you could ask me or one of my second years and you could figure it out pretty quick. Dr. Hoffman does a great job at explaining everything. She is very concise and easy to understand. And outside resources to use for this class would be Boards and Beyond with pre-made Anki decks. I've made Anki decks for every single class except human structure, so unfortunately you can't use any IU specific Anki decks for this class. But Anki does an okay job. There is not too much overlap with Boards and Beyond and human structure. This is the only class at IU where that's the case, but you can do your best. For practice questions, I'd recommend BRS, which is, I think, is the most important practice questions for this class. And there's also Gray's Anatomy, which is kind of optional, and the IU practice exam on Canvas. Each exam for this class will have a corresponding IU practice exam, and with my experience, it is the best indicator for performance on the actual test. So to sum it up, my approach to the lecture portion of human structures would be to watch each Fort Wayne lecture, and because I don't have any pre-made Anki decks for this class, you could make your own if you really wanted, or take notes, but it's pretty time consuming, so that's only optional. And then after the Fort Wayne lecture, you could see if there's a corresponding Boards and Beyond video. If there is one, great. And then you'd watch it, unsuspend the corresponding Anki cards, which if you don't know what unsuspending Anki cards means, I will have that in my Anki guide. And then after you watch the BNB video, if there is one, do the Anki cards, you would do the BRS practice questions. And then at the end of all those practice questions, you would do the IU practice tests. And then you can see your content gaps and then review from there. And again, grades is optional. Some random advice for lecture is that embryo, in my opinion, absolutely sucks. I know a lot of my classmates think the same thing. You can try to learn it, but if you're really adamant on not learning it, you technically don't have to because it's only about 10% of human structure and it's really low yield on step 1, 2. Still give it a try. You really don't want to, you could get away with not learning it at all. And now histology. So Dr. Hoffman at Fort Wayne not only gives lectures for, basic general anatomy, but she also gives a lecture style presentation for each histology one. So I recommend watching that, but I kind of grouped that with the lecture portion because it's very similar. But other than that, I recommend you do the micro from IU. This is kind of the gold standard. It's pretty time consuming, but very comprehensive. Alternatively, you could do the atlas provided on Canvas. This is actually what I ended up doing. I never even touched vMicro. It's a little less comprehensive, but it saves a lot of time. It's very quick. Some outside resources some of my classmates recommended was Yale Histo and NYU Histo. I haven't used either of these, but I got the same thing from quite a few people, so it can't be too bad. As for practice questions, IU on Canvas has quite a bit of practice questions for each section of Histo, and they seem pretty straightforward, and if you can do good on those, you'll do good on the test. So the ideal approach for Histo, do vMicro and or the Atlas, and then do the corresponding IU practice questions. And then again, Yale, NYU Histo are optional. I will say on the morning of the exam, you should review those Canvas practice questions from IU because there have been a lot of repeats on the exam from these. But Histo itself is pretty straightforward. If you study for it, you will do well. Some random advice, I forgot to mention there are some imaging questions on the Histo section, such as X-ray, CT, ultrasound. It's not that many, but there are quite a few. They're not too hard. There's corresponding modules or videos you have to watch for these, and as long as you just watch those at least once, maybe twice, you'll be completely fine. And the final section of human structure is lab. Uh, this, in my opinion, is the hardest part of human structure itself. You have mandatory lab time each week where you'll be dissecting cadaver, but the reality is you'll be going in quite a bit for extra dissection because the time allotted for each mandatory lab just simply isn't enough. And the way we get tested on this is Dr. Saxon will tag 40 things throughout our cadavers. I think there's about 6, and you basically just have to identify them. He likes to tag anomalies on cadavers, so be sure to let your classmates know if your cadaver has any, because chances are he will tag it. And really, lab was not my strong suit, so I didn't really know too much advice I could give to you all, but the questionnaire, I asked a lot of my classmates, they kindly gave quite a bit of good advice, so you guys can pause and read it, and again, they, I'm sure, did a lot better than I did on the lab section, so they have better advice than I would. And speaking of that questionnaire that I sent my classmates, I did include a do's and don'ts section for every class, so I'll just let you all watch it for every class, I guess. So this is the one for human structure. These are the do's. Pause the video if you want to read it all. Some good advice from people that have gone through this entire class. So, and these are the don'ts. I think one common theme is don't pressure yourself to know every single last fact because again, at the end of the day, as long as you pass, get that 67.5 or higher, you have the equivalent of getting 100. So there's literally no benefit in getting an extremely high grade if it's cutting into your health. And I also think it's kind of funny that the second and fourth response here kind of contradict each other. So yeah, with lab, it's really up to you. If you think you need to go into a lot of lab, go in. If you don't think it's that necessary and you're doing just fine on the exams, then obviously don't go too much. After human structures, your next class is going to be MCT. And this stands for molecules, cells, and tissues. So it's got a lot of biochem in it. Unlike human structures, it is going to be graded similar to the rest of your first year classes, where there's just simply exams. And also this class is your first class where you have small group. Now, for the IU lectures, you're going to want to watch Dr. Ram. He's the absolute GOAT. They're usually the statewide ones, so there shouldn't be too much trouble finding them. But again, you could view his lectures from previous years through Kaltura. And for his lectures, he really kind of highlights what's important in them in red or whatever color. So you actually don't need to watch the lectures. You can kind of just view the PowerPoints. Some outside materials could be Boards and Beyond, Anki, of course. First Aid has some nice flow charts of metabolic pathways. And Pixorize, as I mentioned earlier, is for biochem. Now, for the Anki cards, for anything that doesn't have to do with IU, like Boards and Beyond, just use the Anki deck. And then for the statewide Dr. Ram lectures, you can use the Anki cards that I made last year. And that'll be a common theme throughout the rest of the classes in the first year. And really quick, before we continue, I just want to reinforce how amazing Dr. Ram is. He's literally one of the best professors I've ever had. We all love Dr. Ram. Now, some advice with small groups, since you didn't have it in human structures. It's kind of different, A lot of people would never have had something like this in undergrad or especially high school. But basically what we do is we just come together as a group, we work through some problems together usually, and then that's about it. The content covered in small group sometimes aligns with the lecture, sometimes it doesn't. I think in MCT specifically, it really didn't too much. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think what most people have said is it's not a big deal. It's not going to be, the second response saying it wasn't a pass or a fail situation, more of an A versus B. It's really not that important, but you could review it, the morning of the exam just for a couple easy points. Now, the practice questions for MCT, there are quite a bit. Boards and Beyond actually does have questions that correspond with their videos. I forgot to mention earlier, so you definitely could do those. You could do some board vital ones. I know they have biochem ones and also UWorld, but at this point, if you're waiting for the group discount for the UWorld bundle, you won't have it yet, so you might not be able to do those. And then the IU does have a practice test for every exam, just like human structures, which again is a pretty good predictor. So my best approach for MCT would be to watch Dr. Ram's lecture, do my corresponding Anki deck, and then if applicable, watch the BNB videos, do the corresponding Anki cards, and the BNB practice questions. And you can do board vitals practice questions if you want. And then again, at the end, do the IU practice test. That'll give you your content gaps, and you can review the content gaps. And yeah, review a small group if you really feel like. Now, some random advice. The first exam in MCT was pretty rough. For some reason, there was a lot of content on the test that didn't align with the lectures. Don't be discouraged though if you don't do very well in this, because the second and third exam for MCT are a lot easier. Finally, you can suspend my cards after MCT is done, because again, I make cards for more lower yield things that are IU specific. But keep doing those Anki cards, because you're going to need to know that information basically throughout the rest of your medical career, or at least until you're done with your boards exams. And really quick, here are the do's and don'ts for this class. Pause if you want to read them. And after MCT, you have winter break. You're done with a semester of med school. That's amazing. So a common question is, do you keep studying during winter break? And the common consensus with my class is, if you did those Anki cards, which I know a lot of you will be doing, you can keep up with those reviews, which it shouldn't be too time consuming every day, maybe a few minutes, no more than half an hour a day. And as for new content, if you really want, you can, but I think the best thing to do in winter break is to enjoy the time off away from school, because you're not going to have too many more times like this in your life. Now, the first class back from winter break is going to be FHD. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really remember what this stands for, and I'm too lazy to look it up. But just know that this class basically teaches you some basic pathology, cardiology, pulm, and renal. And there's going to be small groups again, as there will be for the rest of your first year. So you got to get used to it. The IU lectures are simply the statewide ones with corresponding Anki cards that I have made. And as for outside resources, there's Boards and Beyond for a lot of things. It's very good for cardio, pulm, and renal. There's also Pathoma for the pathology, and Sketchy for a few drugs. Now, for the cards, for Anki, for these, you're going to use Anki once again, because you use mine for the IU lectures and then Anki for everything else. Now, practice questions. Boards and Beyond does come with some practice questions, so you can do those. Some people use BRS, some use UWorld, but I think most importantly is to do those IU practice questions right before each test, just to see where your content gaps lie, because again, it's a very good indicator of how you do on the real test. So, ideal approach, watch statewide lectures, do my Anki, then you can watch applicable BNB videos, Pathoma, Sketchy, all that, and then do practice questions if you want. And again, you can review a small group if you want. For this class, small group doesn't play very big of a role on the test. So even if you don't review it at all, you'd still easily be able to pass most of these exams. So this class is pretty straightforward. If you study, you'll be fine. And again, suspend my cards at the end of this class because they're low yield, but keep up with the Anki. And here are the do's and don'ts for FHD. Pretty straightforward. Pause if you want, and then that'll be it for FHD. So after FHD, you have a class called Host Defense, simply HD. This is also about 1.5 months. Now, the first exam in this class is about immunology, and the second and third are about microbiology. So as for RU lectures goes, you're going to watch the statewide ones for the first exam, and I really do not recommend watching them for the second and third. They're very boring, and you're not going to really learn too much. You're going to get very bored and sleepy and not want to watch those. Now, outside resources, 100% watch Sketchy and do the corresponding Anki cards. You could also watch B&B or read First Aid for some microbiology tips, but I just recommend Sketchy over everything else. And because the first exam is about immunology, you could watch Pixorize. It might help you a little bit, but again, the pricing is kind of high. As far as practice questions go, UWorld and Board Vitals are very good at microbiology and immunology. And surprisingly, the IU practice tests were not very good for this class, so I do not recommend them too much. You can if you want, but they weren't that amazing. So the best approach for the first exam, simply watch statewide lectures, do the cards I've made, and then do whatever practice questions you need. Second exam, watch the Sketchy, bacteria and viruses specifically, unless the curriculum has changed for you guys. But for us, the second exam was purely over bacteria and viruses. And then watch the Sketchy pharmacology videos about the drugs against these. And again, do practice questions. Third exam, same as second, but instead of bacteria and viruses, it's going to be fungi and parasites. So some random advice for this class, like MCT, the first exam was pretty tough, but the next two were very easy. So if you don't do very good on the first exam, I'm sure you're going to be happy to know the next two are a lot easier. And here are the do's and don'ts. I think a common trend is Sketchy is a very big do. You absolutely want to do Sketchy. It's cartoons, it's entertaining, it's really the most enjoyable way I've ever had learning in my life. You don't really feel like you're studying watching those. And that's about it for HD. The last class of first year is Neuroscience and Behavior, which is the first UDOS course you'll be having. And UDOS courses are basically system-based classes. And in this class, it's going to be neuro and psych as the systems you're learning. So because of that, there's a lot of overlap in terms of content with outside resources such as Sports Beyond, First Aid, Sketchy, all of that. And as a result, I no longer made flashcards for this, just because while there is some low yield information, it's not a crazy amount that warrants a huge Anki deck. So as far as Anki goes, I highly recommend you just do the Anki cards for this deck. But still, you can view the IU statewide lectures. I think they're pretty good. As far as practice question goes, you can do basically any question bank at this point, because once you're at these system-based classes, they go very well with literally any question bank. So UWorld, Board Vitals, whatever you're comfortable with. And the IU practice tests actually are good in this class, once again, unlike HD. The best approach for this class would be to watch the statewide lectures. There's no Clark cards, so you can't do any Anki there, but you can do the corresponding B&B, Sketchy, and read First Aid if you want, and do the Anki cards for those. And then, yeah, do whatever question bank you want. I will note that small group is pretty important in this class, especially the histo, and you do go in lab twice for anatomy. At least we did. You might be going in a little bit more. So just some random advice. Spend some good time in small group, especially histo, and then yeah, review that brain anatomy. I know it sucks, but there is actually quite a bit on the test, and if you know your brain anatomy and your histo, then you should do just fine. And because I mentioned how important small group was for this class, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of throw in the advice for the small group for this class, so you can see it real quick and pause it if you want. And this is the do's for this class. Pause it if you want. And here are the don'ts. Again, you can pause it if you'd like. And that wraps up your first year of medical school. Not too bad, right? Anyways, a lot of people do wonder what they should be doing for the summer, and it's really up to them. If you want to kind of bulk up your application for residency, by all means you can, and there's plenty of options. Specifically, I want to talk about two, one of them being Impress, which is a summer research program affiliated with IU, where you go to a regional campus, usually ND, and you just do research that summer and do a poster presentation at the end. And you get a 5,000 or higher stipend with it, which really isn't too bad. Also, you can do the scholarly concentration program. Each campus has one, and it's pretty easy to apply. I think both Impress and the SCP, you can apply pretty early on in the year. With Impress, it might be around January of your spring semester, so right when it starts. And then the SEP, you apply, I think, during the fall semester at some point. You'll get an email about all this stuff, so don't worry about that. But I do want to note that during your summer, you should relax because this is quite literally your last summer you get off. Between second and third year, you're going to be using that time to study and take step one, and then you immediately have to go into third year rotations. So you do not get summer for that year. So really, no matter what you do, if you're going to be productive, if you're going to relax, just try to enjoy your summer as much as you can because that truly is your last summer. I do want to say that all of you watching, feel free to reach out to me if you ever need help with school or anything else. I've included my email, my cell phone, so just I'll respond to anybody. And I look forward to meeting you all. I hope this guide really helped you get into the, mood of med school and get ready for first year. And I'm sure all of you are going to do great.